We're covering an introduction to using workflows in FinPower Connect. This is the first in a three-part series, with next week covering off more of the configuration aspects via the user interface, and the third session being a code support workflows scripting session specifically. First things first, licensing requirements to use the functionality described in the next three sessions is, of course, the Workflows add-on, but also depending on what is built into the workflow, it's important to remember that other licensing may also be required. For example, credit inquiries, web services and automation, etc. So what is a workflow? The workflow functionality in FinPower Connect provides the ability to build a process for users to follow that can not only streamline processes and help ensure essential steps aren't missed, but also save time by having certain actions happen automatically, either at a client, account, or application level. Each workflow is a series of steps that a user can work through in an easy to follow format, either from the workflow form itself or via Task Manager. Workflows can also include automation for parts of the process where appropriate and available, like sending documents, texts, tests, and decision cards. Some automations do require a bit of scripting, whereas others are available out of the box. They can allow the ability for a user to track what needs to be done across all workflows allocated to them in Task Manager, with workflows appearing for action when required in the list of tasks and in the workflow folders as well to see what will be coming up and for easy access. Workflows can be added by various processes automatically within FinPower Connect as well, such as account rules, global settings for payment reversals, and by script. And when added, workflows can be automatically allocated to users or roles based on the weighting set on the workflow itself in conjunction with the sample workflow allocation script. Allocations can be updated to also allow for easy management of staff leave to ensure that work is not distributed to that user while they're on leave. Types and examples. There are three different types of workflows available for configuration. The first being client. Client type workflows are saved against the client records themselves and can be created to facilitate any client-based process. For example, you might have an anti-money laundering workflow to take a user through the client onboarding process and to ensure that you are compliant with the AML regulations, factoring in things like ID checks and address verification, etc. Or you might have a workflow at a client level to manage things like deceased estates or bankruptcies, where all of a client's accounts would be impacted, making the client level a logical place to manage the process. Account type workflows can be all sorts of things, from loan origination workflows to collections processes, to hardship application and management workflows, documentation process workflows, and much more. Loan origination being the gathering of the necessary information to assess a borrower's ability to repay the loan, with things like bank statement checks and credit checks, checking potential security, and so on. Hardship workflows could put the account in a specific monitor category, which can then tie in with other things. For example, the CCR hardship reporting, and prompt users to suspend credit bureau defaults, hold collection action, and more. Collections workflows could be added automatically using account rules with overdue tests if configured to do so, could send SMS reminders and or letters and emails to remind the borrower that they are overdue before a user needs to pick it up, potentially resolving some cases of arrears before a user needs to call the client or complete any action. They can also be configured to wait for a period of time after these steps and then run another overdue test. And if the account is no longer overdue, close the workflow. Account application type workflows would be mainly, again, things like client identification or AML documentation and loan origination, where a client is using the account applications module in FinPower Connect. Moving on to the basic structure of a workflow. Because a workflow is essentially a way to build a process and to follow a logical flow, I thought it easiest to explain the basic structure of a workflow in this way. Workflows have groups, and these groups contain individual items. The individual items can contribute to a group outcome or different outcomes, which determines the next group to be added or potentially the closure of a workflow. Depending on the outcome, sometimes item outcomes can add in additional items where required. How it is structured overall really depends on the process itself. Together, groups and their items come together to allow a user to easily follow the required process as defined by the business, taking the guesswork out of things and potentially automating some of the core items within a process, saving a business both time and money. For example, a lender will likely have a collections process. Most of us will know that it's not often that each overdue account will follow the same path throughout a collections process, and that several factors can change the path the account must follow based on a lender's business practices. Taking overdue loan examples, one loan may only stay overdue for 14 days, and therefore it's possible that the only collection action that ended up being required was an SMS reminder to the borrowers that the account is overdue. Another may progress further to say 30 days overdue, and the borrowers finally made contact with the lender and made a promise to pay arrangement to clear the arrears that need to be monitored, but no further collection action was required at that stage. And another may end up at 90 days overdue, having had several steps taken to make contact with the borrowers to remedy the arrears, and may require more serious collection action, such as letters to advise of security repossession or advising of a credit bureau default lodgement, and so on. Therefore, a workflow needs to be able to cater for any scenario that may occur throughout that process, and each step must be built into the workflow with the ability to be added when required and not added or completed when not required. Essentially being built based off a decision tree or flowchart so that each outcome is carefully considered and the right action is then taken. As I said in our decision cards training session, the best way to start with a workflow is to have a process mapped out before you start building it. We'll cover more on the actual configuration of the workflows in our next session, as I mentioned earlier. So the items that can be added to the groups, there are multiple out-of-the-box options that are available, as you can see from this image. Today I'll cover off the most common out-of-the-box options that typically don't require scripting, depending on the overall process requirements. Allocate to user. This option allows a step to be built in to reassign the workflow to a specific user or from the current user to their supervisor. There are scripted options that can reassign if there is a step in the process where a supervisor or credit manager needs to review and assess, say a borderline loan application or a hardship approval. A step can be added to assign the workflow to a user in a certain role, or provide a list of users to choose from to assign the workflow to. Later on in the process, once the relevant staff member has actioned their part of the process, another allocate to user item can be available to reassign the workflow back to the original user. The credit inquiry item adds in the option to launch the credit inquiry wizard from the workflow directly, which is good for a loan origination workflow, as it can be placed in at the opportune time, preventing credit inquiries from being completed too soon or too late, saving time overall. Scripting can be added or a custom decision card after this item to make choices based on the result of the credit inquiry. For example, auto-declining an application where the credit score is below a certain number or contains any credit bureau defaults. As with decision cards, the sky's the limit with workflows, depending on how much automation and scripting you need or want to be involved. Bank account inquiry option adds the ability to automatically send a bank account inquiry request directly from the workflow. The bank account inquiry review option is designed to work in conjunction with a decision card to analyse the results of a bank account inquiry. This one does require some scripting. The security inquiries item adds the option to launch the security inquiry wizard from the workflow directly without the need to navigate to the security menu. This also then connects the log stored against the workflow for easy access if required later. The previous item credit inquiry does the same, another streamlining feature that is available as part of the Workflows module. The PPSR search adds the option to launch the PPSR search wizard. Register security statement will register the attached security on the PPSR. Account restructure and payment arrangement options are only available on account workflows only for obvious reasons. And these types launch their respective wizards from the workflow directly, which again can be really handy depending on the process you're building. Sending documents allows a document to either be sent manually or automatically, depending on the item settings and the document settings. Questions. Now this item type is pretty versatile, meaning it can be used for all sorts of things. The most obvious being asking a direct question, where the user is prompted to select an answer or response. The option selected can either set an outcome or perform an action. For example, the question may be simple, like, is the client within the minimum age criteria? In this instance, we're referring to a simple question prompt to the user rather than a decision card accessing this. The user can respond with either a yes or a no, or potentially a not applicable if appropriate. And what happens next is determined by the response. A yes might register a success outcome and then continue to the next item in the group. A no might prompt the user to send a declined document as the next item, or automatically send a document advising they do not meet criteria at this time and then close the workflow. The HTML widgets item adds the ability to launch built-in widgets from a workflow item, and HTML widget scripts adds the ability to launch custom widgets from a workflow item. The incoming and outgoing communication items launch a form to record a log for incoming and outgoing call notes and apply follow-up tasks if required. The test, as we've mentioned before, performs a test depending on the options selected. For example, one of the options available is an overdue status test. Another is a contractual overdue status test, balance or credit limit condition tests, or an uncleared funds test. It's also possible to test monitor categories. And finally, a wait item, which can be added to delay further processing of a workflow when time is needed. For example, waiting for a client to return documentation, or perhaps to wait to retest an accounts overdue status. Right, moving along to the workflow form itself, which is one of the areas a user can work a workflow. Opening the workflow form from the record they're attached to is one way to get to it, or going to the process menu and going to workflows. The workflow form itself contains the key details summary page where the user should be largely working through the items in the items block. In our example here, you can see the option to click on various options as the items come up, and the workflow will progress through as you go. If you see an orange arrow to action an item, it will action the item and subsequently run through any automatic items underneath it. What happens when the orange arrow is clicked depends on the item type. For example, as we'd just covered before, a payment arrangement item will launch the payment arrangement wizard to prompt the user to complete the payment arrangement. If the item isn't relevant, a user may click not applicable and move on to the next step in the process. Question items won't have an orange arrow to click. Instead, there will be blue text with available answers. Questions with item group completion set outcomes will potentially have a green tick to set a yes outcome and a red cross to set a no outcome. The workflow will then be processed based on what is configured for the relevant outcomes, usually either adding another group or part of the process, or even closing a workflow or adding a new workflow depending on the process requirement. At the very top of the page, if switched on, you can see what's called a train stop diagram. And If you have been through more than one group in the process, there will be multiple boxes up here. I'll find another example shortly. But clicking on these will bring up the items contained in that group, so you can see at a glance where the workflow or account client has been and what's happened so far and what's coming next. The key details page also contains other blocks for fast access to key information, such as an account block with hyperlinks available to open the account or client record directly if required. The general page, which contains the basic workflow information, such as the code description, linked record ID, status flag color, and notes and recall details. The items page is where groups can be manually added on the individual workflow itself if required, which shouldn't really be necessary if the workflow type is built properly, but it can happen sometimes. So there's a little button strip down here and the available group items will appear to be added. The users page is where groups can, displays who the current allocated user is and will also show the history of previous allocated users. The logs page links the applicable client, account, or application logs to the workflow, so they can all be seen or accessed in the same place, which is really handy. This is particularly handy when things like credit checks are required, which are usually saved against the client rather than the account, but as an item available on an account type workflow, as an example. The user-defined page, which in my example here is blank, but as with other areas of FinPower Connect, is available to be customized using things like parameter sets if required, and this is typically used in conjunction with scripting. And the audit page will track what is optionally set in global settings for the workflow audit options, for which the available options are auditing when a workflow is placed on hold, when the recall date is manually changed, when the recall immediately date is set or cleared, when the workflow hold is cancelled, and when the workflow user-defined fields have been changed. Also available from the workflow form itself are the Actions menu down the left-hand side here, and the Other Actions menu. These menus offer additional actions that may be required from time to time, such as manually closing a workflow, putting the workflow on hold, etc. The other actions offer the ability to locate the workflow in Task Manager, which can be useful if they've got to the workflow via the account, but prefer to work it from Task Manager itself. The Perform Actions option, which allows several ad hoc options to be processed in succession. We click on that, you'll see it launches a wizard, gives you the option to select multiple for things like log entry, incoming communication logs, sending a document, email, SMS, updating the allocated user, setting the recall date, and so on. Each of these items can also be done on an individual level by the other subsequent available other actions. So the more common way, or the best designed way probably to work workflows, obviously from Task Manager. So this is what we're reviewing now. And we can see all the workflows allocated to, for example, our administrator, ready to go in these workflow folders here. As you can see from this form, they can use the button strip below to do things like make payment arrangements, send SMS messages, emails, and document communications. And they can update monitor categories and set flags where applicable, and so on. They can see recalled workflows in the specific recalled folder, view unallocated workflows that need to be picked up, and specifically view any workflows that are on hold in a list form. We don't have any here at the moment, making their overall workload nice and easy to maintain. Again, they can work that directly from the Task Manager form, with our key detail summary being available below the grid here. There is a separate session coming up on Task Manager in the near future where we can go through these in a bit more detail. Demo workflows. We have two basic sample workflows available in the demo database, showing some examples of how workflows themselves can be built. So this being one of them, the OD sample workflow. This form here is the workflow type admin library, which again, we're going to be going through in more depth next week. And this is where you actually build and construct your workflow type. But that shows here clearly some groups and the items that they contain for this sample. They're deliberately built using out-of-the-box functionality with little to no scripting involved and can be worked through with an Intersoft dealer or, where applicable, Intersoft directly to tailor these workflows to the needs of the business specifically in terms of what outcomes need to be set and what fits in with the business's normal practices and what may require a little bit of tweaking, but they make an excellent starting point. Custom workflows can also be built by your Intersoft dealer. Scripting can, of course, be added to these workflows to increase automation instances or add additional functions not available as a standard item type if required, or for which quotes can be supplied. Please contact your Intersoft dealer for more information. The other one that is available in the demo database is the sample application workflow. Again, I can't stress enough when you start out building these, a process mapped out will absolutely make this process a lot easier. And before we finish for today, just wanted to cover off some typical customizations for automation with workflows. So often larger companies opt to customize their workflows using scripting for things like different ways of allocating workflows, further automation of processing items like fully automated credit inquiries, etc., and options to pull information from user data and pre-populate information on various item types or in documents as and when required. So we've come to the end of what I had prepared for us today, but as always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions.